The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls as Jake Harrison led his limping horse toward Brennan's general store, trying to ignore the snickers and pointed comments that followed their slow progress through town. Thunder, once the finest stallion in 3 counties, now moved with the halting gait that had made him the subject of cruel jokes and unsolicited advice from every self-proclaimed horse expert in the territory. Jake's weathered face showed no emotion as he heard the familiar taunts that had become part of his weekly routine. At 35, he had the lean build and sun-darkened skin of a man who had spent his entire adult life working cattle on the harsh Colorado plains. But his usually confident demeanor had been worn down by months of ridicule and financial strain. "There goes Jake Harrison with that worthless nag of his," called out Pete Morrison from the steps of the saloon, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Should have put that animal out of its misery months ago instead of throwing good money after bad on feed." The comment drew laughter from the group of men gathered outside Murphy's saloon, most of whom had been drinking since dawn and were eager for entertainment at someone else's expense. Jake recognized several faces among them, cattle buyers who had once competed for his business, neighboring ranchers who had envied his success, and townspeople who seemed to take pleasure in watching a proud man brought low by circumstances beyond his control. Thunder had been injured 6 months earlier during a stampede that had cost Jake nearly half his herd and almost his own life. The magnificent black stallion had thrown himself between Jake and a charging bull, taking a horn thrust to his left shoulder that had saved his owner's life, but permanently damaged the horse's mobility. The veterinarian from Denver had recommended immediate euthanasia, declaring that Thunder would never again be suitable for ranch work. Jake had refused to accept that verdict, spending his dwindling savings on treatments and specialists who promised miracle cures that never materialized. Thunder's injury had healed as well as could be expected, but the proud stallion that had once been able to outrun any horse in the territory now struggled to maintain even a walking pace without obvious pain and difficulty. "Morning, Jake," said Sarah Whitfield as she emerged from the general store, her arms full of supplies for her family's ranch. Sarah was the daughter of William Whitfield, one of the most successful cattle barons in the region, and at 26 she was widely considered one of the most eligible women in Cedar Falls. What made Sarah different from the other unmarried women in town was her genuine kindness and her complete lack of interest in the social hierarchies that dominated frontier life. She had been quietly courting Jake for the past year, much to her father's disapproval and the shock of local society matrons who couldn't understand why a wealthy rancher's daughter would choose a struggling homesteader over the numerous wealthy suitors who had sought her hand. "Morning, Sarah," Jake replied, touching the brim of his hat in the respectful gesture that had become automatic whenever he encountered the woman who had somehow agreed to become his wife despite his recent run of bad fortune. Sarah's eyes moved to Thunder with the same gentle concern she had shown every time she encountered the injured horse. Unlike everyone else in town, she had never suggested that Jake should give up on his faithful companion, understanding instinctively that the bond between man and horse ran deeper than mere practical considerations. "How's he doing today?" Sarah asked, approaching Thunder slowly and allowing him to catch her scent before reaching out to stroke his neck with practiced gentleness. "About the same," Jake replied honestly. "Dr. Peterson says there's nothing more to be done medically. But Thunder seems to be managing the pain better than he was a month ago." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Harold Blackston, a wealthy cattle buyer from Denver, who had been pursuing Sarah's affections with the kind of aggressive persistence that money often encouraged. Blackstone rode a magnificent chestnut gelding that represented everything Thunder had once been: powerful, fast, and perfectly suited for the demanding work of managing cattle across vast stretches of open range. "Miss Whitfield," Blackston said, tipping his expensive hat with exaggerated courtesy while pointedly ignoring Jake's presence. "I trust you're still planning to attend the harvest dance this Saturday evening?" Sarah's smile was polite but cool as she responded to Blackstone's attention. "Yes, Mr. Blackstone, I'll be there. With my fiancé, Jake Harrison." The reminder of Sarah's engagement clearly irritated Blackstone, whose eyes moved to Thunder with obvious disdain. "Miss Whitfield, surely a woman of your refinement deserves better than a man who can't even afford to keep a healthy horse. What kind of life can he possibly provide for someone of your station?" Jake felt his jaw tighten with anger at Blackstone's crude attempt to undermine his relationship with Sarah, but he had learned through bitter experience that responding to such provocations usually made situations worse rather than better. The reality was that Blackstone's criticism had some foundation in truth. Jake's financial difficulties were well known, and his stubborn refusal to replace Thunder with a functional horse had become a symbol of his supposedly poor judgment. "Mr. Blackstone," Sarah replied with steel in her voice, "I'm perfectly capable of choosing my own companions based on character rather than the condition of their livestock. Jake Harrison is twice the man you'll ever be, and Thunder is worth more than all your fancy horses combined because he represents loyalty and courage rather than mere commerce." Blackstone's face flushed with anger at Sarah's sharp rebuke, but before he could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose grim expression suggested urgent official business. "Jake," the sheriff said, dismounting from his horse with obvious haste, "I need to talk to you about something important. There's been trouble at the Garrett Ranch, and I think you might be able to help." The Garrett Ranch was located about 15 miles south of Cedar Falls, in a remote valley that had been the site of increasing tension between homesteaders and a group of land speculators who wanted to force out the small farmers and consolidate their holdings for large-scale cattle operations. "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Someone burned out 3 homestead families last night," Sheriff Bradley replied grimly. "The Garretts, the Hendersons, and the Johnsons. All of them barely escaped with their lives. And they lost everything: houses, barns, livestock, and crops ready for harvest." The news sent a chill through Jake's heart as he realized the implications for his own small ranch and for Sarah's safety as his intended bride. The land speculators had been growing increasingly aggressive in their tactics, and burning out homesteaders was a time-tested method of clearing desired property for new ownership. "Do you know who's behind it?" Sarah asked, her face pale with concern for the affected families. Sheriff Bradley glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard before responding in a low voice. "I can't prove anything yet, but I suspect it's connected to the Cedar Valley Development Company. They've been trying to buy up all the small ranches in that area for months, and they haven't been taking no for an answer gracefully." Jake knew the Cedar Valley Development Company well, as they had approached him several times with increasingly aggressive offers to purchase his land at well below market value. Their representatives had made it clear that refusing their offers might result in various forms of misfortune, though they had been careful to phrase their threats in legal language that couldn't be used against them in court. "Sheriff," Jake said carefully, "are you asking me to help with the investigation? Or are you warning me that my ranch might be next on their list?" "Both," Bradley replied honestly. "I need men I can trust to help me gather evidence. And I also think you should take precautions to protect your property and Miss Whitfield." Harold Blackstone had been listening to this conversation with obvious interest, and now he inserted himself back into the discussion with typical arrogance. "Sheriff, surely you're not seriously considering asking Harrison for help with something this dangerous? A man who can't even manage to keep his horse functional isn't likely to be much use in dealing with professional arsonists." The insult to both Jake and Thunder was the final straw for Sarah, whose normally gentle demeanor transformed into something fierce and protective. "Mr. Blackstone, Jake Harrison has more courage and integrity in his little finger than you have in your entire body. And Thunder may be injured, but he's still worth 10 of your pretty show horses when it comes to real work." As if summoned by Sarah's passionate defense, Thunder raised his head and fixed Blackston with a look that carried unmistakable intelligence and dignity. Despite his physical limitations, the stallion's bearing still reflected the noble spirit that had made him legendary throughout the territory during his prime years. "We'll see about that," Blackston muttered. Clearly stung by Sarah's rebuke and Thunder's apparent contempt, Jake placed a protective hand on Sarah's arm, grateful for her loyalty, but worried about the enemies her fierce defense might be creating. "Sarah, it's all right. Let people think what they want about Thunder and me. We know the truth, and that's what matters." But even as Jake spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that Thunder's reputation and his own were about to be tested in ways that would determine not just their standing in the community, but possibly their very survival. 3 days after Sheriff Bradley's warning about the land speculators, Jake Harrison stood in his barn before dawn, carefully checking Thunder's legs and shoulders for any signs of increased pain or swelling. The morning ritual had become as automatic as breathing over the past months, a quiet time when man and horse could assess each other's condition without the scrutiny of a hostile world. Thunder nickered softly as Jake's experienced hands moved over the injury site, the stallion's trust in his owner evident despite the months of discomfort and reduced capability. The bond between them had actually grown stronger since the accident, forged in the crucible of shared adversity and mutual dependence. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured as he worked. "I know it still hurts, but you're doing better than those fools in town give you credit for." The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused both man and horse to tense with alertness. Visitors at this hour usually meant trouble, and Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the Winchester rifle that was never far from reach since Sheriff Bradley's warning about the land speculators. Through the barn's open doorway, Jake could see 3 riders approaching his small ranch house in the gray pre-dawn light. He recognized the lead figure immediately, Clayton Webb, the smooth-talking representative of the Cedar Valley Development Company, who had been making increasingly aggressive offers to purchase Jake's land. Webb was accompanied by 2 men whom Jake didn't recognize, but whose bearing and weaponry marked them as professional enforcers rather than legitimate businessmen. Their presence transformed what might have been a routine business discussion into something far more ominous. "Mr. Harrison," Webb called out as the group reached the house. "I hope we're not disturbing you too early, but we have urgent business to discuss." Jake emerged from the barn leading Thunder, partly because he needed to turn the horse out to pasture, and partly because he had learned that having Thunder nearby often provided a psychological advantage in difficult situations. Despite his injury, the stallion's size and presence still commanded respect from most visitors. "Mr. Webb," Jake replied evenly, "it is rather early for a business call. What's so urgent that it couldn't wait for normal hours?" Webb's smile was cold and calculating as he dismounted, his eyes taking in Jake's modest ranch buildings and the surrounding pasture land that represented decades of hard work and careful stewardship. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed regarding our previous discussions about your property, Mr. Harrison. Recent events in the valley have made it clear that small homesteaders are facing increased risks that might best be avoided through prompt relocation." The reference to recent events was clearly meant to invoke the arson attacks on the other homestead families, and Jake felt his jaw tighten with anger at Webb's barely veiled threat. "Mr. Webb, if you're suggesting that I should sell my land because I'm afraid of being burned out, you've seriously misjudged my character." "Not at all," Webb replied smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out that a smart businessman recognizes when circumstances have shifted in ways that make his position untenable. A man with a lame horse and a beautiful fiancée has a lot to lose if he makes poor decisions about his future." The mention of Sarah sent a chill through Jake's blood, transforming Webb's words from mere business pressure into direct personal threat. The two enforcers had positioned themselves strategically to cover all approaches to the ranch buildings, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Are you threatening Miss Whitfield?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Thunder shift nervously beside him. "Threatening? Certainly not," Webb replied with mock innocence. "I'm merely observing that accidents can happen to anyone, especially people who insist on remaining in areas that have become unstable. Miss Whitfield is a lovely young woman who deserves to marry. Someone who can provide proper security for her future." Jake's hand moved toward his rifle, but one of Webb's enforcers cleared his throat meaningfully and adjusted his position to provide a better angle of fire. The message was clear. Any aggressive move on Jake's part would result in immediate violence. "What exactly are you proposing, Webb?" Jake asked, forcing himself to remain calm despite the rage building in his chest. "The same generous offer we've made before, with one modification," Webb replied, producing a legal document from his coat. $500 for your land, livestock, and buildings, with the requirement that you leave Colorado Territory within 1 month of the sale date. $500 for property worth at least $3,000, with the added humiliation of forced exile from the territory where Jake had spent his entire adult life. The offer was so insulting that it barely qualified as extortion rather than outright theft. "And if I refuse?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Webb's smile became even colder as he gestured toward his armed companions. "Then I'm afraid you'll discover that life can become quite difficult for stubborn homesteaders who refuse to acknowledge changing circumstances. Barns can burn, cattle can scatter, and people can have unfortunate accidents." The threat was now explicit, and Jake understood that he was facing men who had no intention of accepting refusal as an answer. The recent attacks on other homesteads had been designed to soften up remaining targets like himself, making them more amenable to negotiation. Before Jake could respond to Webb's ultimatum, the sound of a galloping horse interrupted the tense confrontation. Sarah Whitfield appeared over the ridge, riding hard toward the ranch with obvious urgency. Her unexpected arrival clearly annoyed Webb, who had probably timed his visit to avoid witnesses to his intimidation tactics. "Jake!" Sarah called out as she approached. "Thank goodness you're all right. I heard in town that Webb was riding this way with armed men, and I was afraid something might happen." Sarah's presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. Webb couldn't afford to threaten or harm the daughter of one of the territory's most influential cattle barons, and her arrival as a potential witness to his extortion attempt put him at a significant disadvantage. "Miss Whitfield," Webb said with forced courtesy, "how delightful to see you again. I trust your father is well." "My father is fine, Mr. Webb," Sarah replied coldly, positioning her horse between Jake and the two armed enforcers. "Though he'll be very interested to hear about your early morning visit to my fiancé's ranch." The implied threat was clear. Webb's activities would be reported to William Whitfield, who had enough political and economic influence to cause serious problems for the Cedar Valley Development Company if he chose to intervene. Webb's smile became strained as he realized that his intimidation tactics had been compromised by Sarah's unexpected arrival. "Miss Whitfield, I'm sure there's no need to trouble your father with routine business discussions. Mr. Harrison and I were simply concluding some property negotiations by threatening to burn his buildings and harm his livestock," Sarah asked with deceptive sweetness. "I'm sure Sheriff Bradley would find such negotiations very interesting indeed." The mention of the sheriff clearly alarmed Webb's enforcers, who began glancing toward possible escape routes in case the situation deteriorated further. Jake sensed that the balance of power in the confrontation was shifting in his favor, but he also understood that cornered predators were often at their most dangerous. "Jake," Sarah continued, "I came to invite you and Thunder to the harvest dance this Saturday. Father specifically requested that you bring Thunder, as he wants to show some visiting cattle buyers what a real ranch horse looks like, even if he's not in perfect condition." The invitation was clearly a public declaration of support from the Whitfield family, and its implications weren't lost on anyone present. Webb's face showed his understanding that threatening Jake Harrison now meant potentially making an enemy of one of the most powerful families in the territory. Thunder, as if sensing the importance of the moment, raised his head proudly and fixed Webb with a look that seemed to embody all the dignity and strength that had made him legendary despite his current limitations. The stallion's bearing reminded everyone present that true worth wasn't always measured by external appearances. "Mr. Webb," Jake said finally, "I believe our business here is concluded. My answer to your offer is no, and it will remain no regardless of any future circumstances that might arise." Webb's expression showed his frustration at being outmaneuvered, but he was too experienced a predator to continue pushing when the odds had shifted against him. "Very well, Mr. Harrison, but circumstances in this valley continue to evolve, and I hope you'll reconsider our generous offer before it's too late." As Webb and his enforcers rode away, Jake felt Sarah's hand take his in a gesture of solidarity and support. Thunder pressed his muzzle against Jake's shoulder, offering his own form of comfort to the man who had refused to abandon him despite everyone's advice. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "I don't think this is over. Webb and his people won't give up just because Father might object to their methods." Jake nodded grimly, understanding that the confrontation had been postponed rather than resolved. "I know, but at least now I know exactly what we're up against. The stakes are rising and danger is closing in. But Thunder and Jake have powerful allies. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how this showdown unfolds at the Harvest Dance. Saturday evening's Harvest Dance was in full swing at the Cedar Falls Community Hall when the acrid smell of smoke began to drift through the open windows, causing the musicians to falter and dancers to pause mid-step. Jake Harrison, who had been waltzing with Sarah despite the lingering stares and whispered comments about Thunder waiting patiently in the hitching area outside, immediately recognized the distinctive odor of burning buildings. "Fire!" someone shouted from near the entrance, and the festive atmosphere instantly transformed into organized chaos as the entire community mobilized to combat what was every frontier town's greatest fear. Jake pushed through the crowd toward the doors, Sarah close behind him, both of them fearing the worst about the source of the flames. Outside, the night sky glowed orange in the direction of Jake's ranch, confirming his worst suspicions about the origin of the fire. Thunder stood alert among the other horses, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of smoke on the evening breeze. "It's my place," Jake said grimly, quickly untying Thunder's reins while Sarah gathered her riding skirt to mount her own horse. Webb wasn't bluffing about the consequences of refusing his offer. Sheriff Bradley appeared beside them, his face grim in the flickering light from the distant flames. "Jake, I'm organizing a fire brigade, but it'll take us at least 20 minutes to get equipment loaded and reach your ranch. You'd better ride ahead and see if there's anything that can be salvaged." Jake swung into Thunder's saddle, feeling the familiar slight hesitation in the stallion's movement as his injured shoulder took the weight. Around them, other men were mounting horses and loading water barrels onto wagons, but Jake knew that Thunder's slower pace would put them behind the main group despite their head start. "Jake, wait for the others," Sarah called as she struggled to control her spirited mare in the confusion. "It's too dangerous to face this alone." But Jake was already urging Thunder toward the trail that led to his ranch, driven by the desperate hope that he might still be able to save some of his buildings or livestock. Thunder responded with the best speed he could manage, his injured gait more pronounced under the urgency of the situation, but his determination matching his riders. As they rode through the night, Jake could see that the fire was worse than he had initially feared. The glow in the sky suggested that multiple buildings were burning, and he could hear the terrified lowing of cattle being driven away from the flames by some of the ranch hands he employed. They crested the final hill overlooking Jake's property to find a scene from a nightmare. The main house was completely engulfed in flames, its roof already collapsed, and the walls beginning to buckle from the intense heat. The barn was also burning, though less severely, and Jake could see several figures moving around the periphery of the fire in what appeared to be organized arson rather than accidental tragedy. "Sarah!" Jake shouted, suddenly realizing that his fiancée should have been riding directly behind him but was nowhere to be seen. The terrible possibility that Sarah might have taken a different route and arrived at the ranch before him sent ice through Jake's veins. If she was trapped somewhere in the burning buildings, every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death. Thunder seemed to sense Jake's urgency, pushing himself beyond his normal limitations as they descended toward the burning ranch. Despite his injury, the stallion's powerful stride carried them quickly across the uneven ground, his sure-footedness preventing disaster on the treacherous terrain. As they approached the barn, Jake could hear something that made his blood run cold, a woman's voice calling for help from inside the burning building. Sarah had indeed arrived before him and was now trapped in the flames, probably overcome by smoke while trying to rescue some of the animals that were still inside. "Sarah!" Jake called out as he leapt from Thunder's saddle, but the roar of the flames swallowed his voice, and no answer came from within the burning structure. The barn's main entrance was blocked by fallen timbers, and the side doors were inaccessible due to the intensity of the fire in those areas. The only possible entry point was a hayloft window about 15 feet above ground level, reachable only by climbing a wooden ladder that was already beginning to char from the heat. Jake began climbing toward the loft window, but the ladder was too damaged by fire to support his weight. As he fell back to the ground, coughing from the smoke and singed by flying embers, he realized that conventional rescue methods were not going to work. It was then that Thunder made a decision that would redeem his reputation and save 2 lives. The injured stallion approached the burning barn and positioned himself directly beneath the loft window. Despite the obvious pain that standing in one place caused his damaged shoulder, understanding immediately what Thunder was offering, Jake climbed onto the stallion's back and stood up in the saddle, using Thunder's height and steady positioning to reach the loft window. The stallion remained perfectly still, despite the smoke, heat, and falling debris that would have spooked most healthy horses. Inside the loft, Jake found Sarah unconscious from smoke inhalation but still alive. Having been protected by a pocket of cleaner air near the window, he lifted her carefully and prepared for the most dangerous part of the rescue, getting both of them safely to the ground while the building collapsed around them. Thunder was still waiting directly below the window when Jake appeared with Sarah's limp form in his arms. The stallion had positioned himself as close to the building as possible while still avoiding the worst of the falling debris, creating the shortest possible drop for the rescue. Jake lowered Sarah as far as he could reach before dropping her gently onto Thunder's saddle, where the unconscious woman draped across the stallion's neck in a position that would have been precarious on any less steady mount. Thunder remained motionless, understanding instinctively that the slightest movement could cause Sarah to fall. Jake dropped from the window onto Thunder's back behind Sarah, and the stallion immediately began moving away from the burning barn with the careful, measured pace that his injury had taught him. Every step was calculated to avoid jarring his precious cargo, and his usually painful gait actually proved advantageous in providing a smooth ride for the unconscious woman. They had barely reached safety when the barn's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, destroying the loft where Sarah would have died, if not for Thunder's courageous assistance in the rescue. The stallion's willingness to risk his own life had saved both Sarah and Jake from a horrible fate. By the time the fire brigade arrived from town, led by Sheriff Bradley and William Whitfield, the immediate crisis was over. Sarah had regained consciousness and was breathing normally, though she would need medical attention for smoke inhalation. Jake's buildings were a total loss, but the most important things in his life had been saved by a lame horse that everyone had dismissed as worthless. Jake, Sheriff Bradley said as the crowd gathered around Thunder and his rescued passengers. "I found evidence that this fire was deliberately set. Webb's enforcers were seen riding away from your property just before the flames were discovered. William Whitfield, Sarah's father, approached Thunder with an expression of profound respect and gratitude. Mr. Harrison, I owe you and your horse an apology. I've been listening to fools who judge worth by appearances rather than character." The wealthy cattle baron extended his hand to Thunder, allowing the stallion to catch his scent before gently stroking the horse's neck. "This animal showed more courage tonight than most men display in a lifetime. I would be honored to help you rebuild your ranch and to welcome both you and Thunder into my family." As the crowd of townspeople gathered around the unlikely heroes, Jake could see that Thunder's reputation had been transformed from object of ridicule to symbol of loyalty and courage. The lame horse that everyone had mocked had proven that true worth couldn't be measured by physical perfection or popular opinion. Harold Blackstone, who had arrived with the fire brigade, approached the group with obvious reluctance. "Harrison," he said grudgingly, "I owe you and your horse an apology." "I was wrong about both of you." Jake accepted the apology with grace, understanding that tonight's events had taught everyone present valuable lessons about judging others based on appearances rather than character. Thunder, despite his permanent injury, had shown that heart and determination were more important than physical perfection. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of Jake's ranch, he sat with Sarah and Thunder, planning the future they would build together. The fire had destroyed his buildings, but it had also burned away the doubts and mockery that had plagued them for months. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation, "I think Thunder deserves the finest stall in whatever barn we build to replace this one." Jake smiled as he stroked Thunder's neck, feeling the powerful muscles that had remained strong despite the injury that had changed their lives. "Thunder's getting the best of everything from now on. He's earned it. The lame horse that had been mocked by an entire town had become its greatest hero, proving that true courage and loyalty could overcome any physical limitation. Thunder's redemption was complete, and his legend would be told for generations in Cedar Falls. What an incredible rescue. Thunder proved that a hero's heart matters more than perfect legs. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of courage and redemption in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with everyone who believes that true worth comes from character, not appearances. What was your favorite moment of Thunder's heroic rescue? Let us know in the comments below.